Welcome, superfans, to episode 4 of the Shuster Herald. I'm your host, Sam Rizzo.
I'm your co-host, Adam Basciano.
On this episode, we'll be looking at episode 3 of the Superboy live-action show, titled Back to Oblivion.
And we also have some potentially big news, movie news, involving Superman and some other of his friends, let's call it. We'll get to that in a bit. Let's start off with the show.
Well, on this episode that aired originally on October 17th, 1988, Back to Oblivion was written by Fred Freiberger, which I mentioned on a previous episode that he wrote some of the comics, the early 80s comics, the New Adventures of Superboy. That was wrong. Thank you to Christian.
You were wrong, Sam? That's
I was wrong, yes.
Kidding.
But he originally is from Star Trek. He's a Star Trek alum writer, and he did most of the season 3 of the show, of the original Star Trek. And I did look this up too, he wrote a couple episodes of the Super Friends from the 70s, which was really interesting. So this was not really his first foray into the DC universe. This was his second, but it was Super Friends that he got his first exposure to the whole DC world, writing-wise. But this episode was directed by Colin Shivers, and the episode saw T.J. White, the son of the Daily Planet news editor Perry White, investigating several acts of violence reported at the scrap heap near Schuster University. He falls victim to the deadly machinery constructed by an old man who owns this scrap yard named Mr. Wagner, played by Abe Vigoda, who was known for The Godfather, his role in The Godfather. So this old man's protecting his scrap yard, basically. And then when Lana Lang hears of this attempt on TJ's life, she goes and defends the poor old Mr. Wagner, saying that he's a fine, upstanding citizen. She even goes out of her way, being a good Samaritan, to the scrap heap to calm the old Mr. Wagner down. And Mr. Wagner tells Lana that he's been hounded for years by inconsiderate children and neighbors, but the old man's past starts to catch up with him as he begins to relive the Nazi Holocaust, because he was a survivor in the Auschwitz camp. So he surrounds himself and protects himself with this scrapyard. And then Lana turns up with some food for the senile old man, and he mistakes her for his murdered granddaughter, Lena. Attempts to reason with Mr. Wagner are futile, and it takes Superboy to brave the scrap heap onslaught by Mr. Wagner that he is prepared for the imaginary Nazi takeover in his mind. So what did you think of this episode, Adam?
Well, I thought it was very interesting for several reasons. First of all, I like the fact that this is the first episode that I can say that T.J. White is actually doing something useful and getting involved.
Yeah, we got to see him be a reporter, an investigator for a change, which was cool.
Yeah, and I think that's important because it separates the T.J. White character. It makes him more than just a stand-in for Jimmy Olsen, because he is, doing the reporting aspect and not just taking pictures, whereas Jimmy Olsen's, typically just a photographer, and Perry White's go-to gopher for coffee and stuff like that. The thing that I find kind of funny is last week we discussed the tie-in comic where TJ really displays no interest in wanting to be a reporter. And then here we go in this episode of the show where you have him actively going after a story. Like he basically goes ahead of Clark. There's a mention in the episode where I guess the two had discussed going together to the scrapyard to investigate what was going on. But TJ takes it upon himself to go at it alone,
Mm-hmm.
and investigate. So I find it interesting that the tie-in comic, which came a year later, kind of is conflicting with the show's earlier portrayal of TJ, in the sense that he's not really that against being a journalist in the show, not as much as he was in the tie-in comic. So I found that a little strange.
Like you said, in the comic book, there was more of a conflict of him wanting to go off and be a comedian, and in the show, he's more in the vein of wanting to be a reporter and wanting to be more of a photographer, journalistic-wise.
Yeah, so it was a bit strange how they were conflicting a bit there. But I did like TJ's role in this episode a lot, and the actor really showed that he's more than just an extra, which is what he had been sort of portrayed as in the first 2 episodes. In terms of the story, the scrapyard stuff and being hounded by the kids is kind of pedestrian, kind of lame, if you will, to start off. But then when they add the whole repressed memories of the Holocaust it becomes a totally different episode with a lot of emotional impact and a very adult, mature themed storyline.
Yeah,
And
I totally agree. Yeah, because it added more weight to it when you saw this man at the end of the episode where he says to Lana, who he mistakens as Lena, and he says to her, "I failed you again," and that I think that had a lot of weight to it.
yeah, and I mean, it really sort of portrays the struggle that survivors of that incident must go. I mean, it must. I don't know anybody personally that's been through that, but I'd imagine it's not
Hmm.
easy to deal with when you've been in that situation. And there are undoubtedly have to be cases where, obviously, I don't think they've gone insane to the level of the old man in the episode, but a sort of post-traumatic stress disorder that he sort of displayed has to play a role in some cases like this. So I think it's a very realistic emotion, but heightened for the sake of the episode.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it just seemed like he really wanted to protect his granddaughter and protect himself to the extent where the scrapyard became his own personal battleground against outsiders, his own fortress, so to speak.
Yeah, and two things I find interesting about that is this episode, again, I think is an example of the writers and everybody involved, again, intentionally or unintentionally. I'm not sure because I'm not in there. I don't know what they were thinking at the time. But earlier Superman stories, there were a couple of scenarios where it shows or references. I mean, again, during World War II, there were stories where you'd see, Nazis and battling Nazis, and he would never get involved in the war effort specifically, but it's calling to mind that era, and Superman was around during that time. So I think it's calling to mind that piece of the history.
Well, I looked at this particular story as the Abe Vigoda, Mr. Wagner storyline is depicting the worst possible events in human history in the Holocaust and showing just how horrible humanity could be at times, but yet with the character of Superboy, humanity could create a character that is so much about the preservation of life and the hope for the future. That's what I saw was those two conflicting little points in this episode, and it really was interesting in that Superboy at the end of the episode says to him, "As long as nobody got hurt or nobody got killed, nobody's to blame." So that was a really nice thing at the end of it, I thought, of the episode, was that Superboy wasn't like, this guy needs to be thrown in jail
Yeah,
for what he did, taking Lana as a hostage and almost killing my friend TJ. Him going in there and saying to Mr. Wagner and Lana, as long as nobody got hurt and nobody's at fault.
you make a great point there because I think that, the fact that humanity as a people can create and idealize such a great character like Superman, and then humanity can also be involved in something as terrible as the Holocaust really shows, the sort of different the two sides, I guess, of humanity. You know what I mean? How complex and we are as a people. But so I think that's an interesting thing that you point out. The fun thing that I thought was cool about this scrapyard, as cheesy as it might come off, this Superman battling machinery in the scrapyard, the fact that the machinery was controlled by the old man was sort of like it's almost like, again, going back to the old comics, the early days when Superman would fight robots, machinery basically.
Right, right.
And so it had that element of, they weren't specifically robots, but they were acting like robots because they were controlled by a human being, right? So it was that Superman versus robot angle that, again, back to the early days. So I like the fact that the writers are doing that. Whether, again, I don't know if it's on purpose, but I like that they're doing that.
Yeah, it was pretty much a callback to like the Fletcher cartoons from the 30s when you
Exactly, exactly.
And I don't know, call me naive for thinking this, but did you get a little feel of Superman 3 when Clark was thrown into that scrap heap and the machine is bearing down on him?
Yeah, yeah, it was very similar.
Very similar to Superman 3, and then Superboy coming through the machinery and stopping TJ from stepping on one of those landmines. Was a really cool moment, I thought, in
It
that
was.
episode. And we got to see TJ interacting with Superboy for the first time. I don't think we've seen him up until this point interact with Superboy, because there's that one point where Superboy points to him and says stop, and he's like, the Superboy. kind of like it's the first time you've seen him in action, really, and he saves him twice,
I
which
would
was
agree, and I think again, what separates the TJ White, this goes a long way in separating the TJ White character from the Jimmy Olsen character, in the sense that yeah, he was sort of wowed by Superman,
mhm.
Superboy. Excuse me. There it is.
Third time, Adam.
Fourth episode. Third time I've done it. It's not gonna end. But but he's wowed by Superman, but he's not as awestruck, I want to say, as Jimmy Olsen would be. I mean, Jimmy Olsen gets flustered like a teenage girl at a Justin Bieber concert when he sees the character
Gal-
of Superman. Whereas,
He'd be like, "Golly, Mister Kent."
yeah, so it's kind of, but TJ was a little bit more reserved in that respect. So again, it just shows you, in case you thought he was a stand-in, he's not. He's his own character, which I liked. And you mentioned the visuals. The visual that you mentioned was really interesting. The other visual I really enjoyed, and I've never seen it before in any live action portrayal of Superman at all, is there was a scene where Clark and Lana were horsing around, just playing around in the pool. And then all of a sudden, I guess, Superboy has to emerge and take off. And what happens is, I've never seen a Clark Kent to Superboy slash Superman change in a pool. I've never seen that
Yeah, that was really something.
in a pool of water, and here it is. We see it, and so I gotta give the creators of the show credit for doing something that I've never seen before. And I've watched a lot of Superman over the years. I've never seen that.
Yeah, that was totally original, and how they did it was the editing on that was just spot on. How
And
they
it came off really well. It looked really good. And now, my in my see, this is why I could never be Superman, because if I was in a pool with Lana Lang and she was wearing that outfit, there ain't no way I'm getting out of that pool. I don't care who's screaming. I don't care what's going on. I'll turn off the superhero. But that's why I'm not. That's why I would be incapable of being Superman. But so the vision, and then the fight against the scrapyard really is the initial display, I think, on the series where we really get a sense of Superman's strength. Or again, there it is, two times in one episode. This is terrible. It's the first time in this series that we get a true example of Superboy's strength. So, and again, all the visual effects sequences were very well done in this episode. In terms of visually, I think this is the best looking special effects wise.
and especially the wire work. I mean, you had John flying in that scrapyard in that little condensed area where he had to fly in and save TJ, and his takeoffs were great too when he flew TJ back to his little van, the Shuster Herald van, and then you see John just shoot up. His takeoffs were great too in the
Yeah,
episode.
everything about the special effects were spot on, and probably the best yet. I mean, I know it's early to say, we're only 3 episodes in.
It was cool to see them connect the future of Clark in this episode with Lana finding the newspaper from the Daily Planet.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's sort of the first real obvious reference, aside from TJ, where you see the Daily Planet, right? And it's kind of cool that it's there, and it's done in a way that is not forced.
Yeah, it felt part of the story. It felt like it was organic and really part of the story that she'd find it, in that back room of the scrapyard.
Yeah, it just so happened to be a Daily Planet issue. It wasn't like she went and she's like, "Well, let's go look in the Daily Planet." You know what I mean? She didn't.
Well, and it kind of confirmed with Mr. Wagner that the war was over, and that the guy has went about trying to talk about his experiences, because in that article she says to him, the war's been over for 15 years and you've done all this humanitarian work by talking about your experiences at
Close to-
at Metropolis University, which was another interesting thing, because isn't that in Smallville, in the Smallville series? That's where Clark goes to college, with Metropolis University instead of
What?
Schuster University. I could
No,
be
I
wrong.
don't know where Clark went to college in Smallville. He was there
For a
a
week.
couple of, he apparently got a journalism degree. Who knows? It must have been an accelerated program. But when you can read at super speed, I guess, what the hell?
hmm
Uh,
Well,
been talking about all the positives of the episode, Sam. Is there anything negative that you found?
I didn't think there was anything really negative about this one.
Well, I did have a slight issue with the episode, and that was, as good as the actor, what was his name again?
Abe Vigoda.
Yeah, as good as he was playing the
The crazy old man.
No, no, the post-traumatic stress disorder kind of thing, and the sort of the um, the reaction to still thinking the Holocaust is happening was good, but there were times initially when you first see him attacking the kids with the scrapyard.
Yeah, with the trash compactor when he was going after TJ.
It came off. It was. I don't think there was a good enough balance between the post-traumatic stress disorder or whatever you want to classify that situation as, and like my problem was, I'm having a hard time saying this. My problem was sometimes it seemed appropriate, and then other times he came off as a crazy mad scientist.
Yeah, it seemed like he was enjoying it when he sent the trash compactor on TJ with the cans,
Yeah,
dropping on him, because he was laughing as he's standing on that platform, and I'm just like, okay.
exactly. He became a maniacal mad scientist, which is very campy and cartoony.
Hmm.
And you know, a scene or two later, you're getting sympathetic emotions out of him, and very tortured emotions out of him because of the Holocaust recollections and stuff like that. And in some places, I felt I felt his performance with the two ranges conflicted. I think he was too over the top in some cases, and that kind of took me out of the.
Yeah, but I was willing to look past that a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. But I was just, it's like, I mean, doesn't really take away from the whole point that the episode's trying to make, but it was a little bit distracting and disturbing at times.
So, how would you rate this episode, Adam?
It's a tough one to rate because it's more of an emotional type episode. There is a little bit of action with Superman fighting the scrapyard. I'm gonna go ahead and give it another 3.5.
Yeah, I'd probably rate it the same. Because, I mean, the message that it's sending, that you have a gentleman in Mr. Wagner who represents a part of humanity, or a time in humanity where it was just a horrible notion that people were being sent to their deaths because of their background and their ethnicity. And then you have a character in Superboy that was created by two Jewish creators and writers from that era, representing a character that still survives and thrives across time. He is the first superhero. He is the light that every superhero follows. And I thought that was the message of this episode, was that you have a gentleman who survived one of the most destructive and horrible times in human history, and then you have a character that has been created by two Jewish creators that created something that spans every culture, every ethnicity, the Superman character. So
Hmm.
I thought that was such an interesting story that they covered with this one episode. So I mean, I give it a 3 out of 5, but the message it sends was a lot heavier and way more important than the special effects in this episode. It was the message of this episode.
Well, the message was great, and even the special effects for what we had, and the little amount of action we had was fantastic. And
And we did get to see, for the first time on film, Superboy getting shot.
that is right. Yeah, yeah.
And the way John shielded Lana with his forearm and the bullet bouncing off his forearm, that was a cool moment. That was a really cool moment.
The only reason I won't give it higher than a 3.5 out of 5 is that I've yet to really be wowed by an episode yet.
Well, it's coming. It's coming.
Well, it's coming, but I mean, until that happens, I can't go high. I feel remiss, especially given the other two episodes, of going higher in a sense. But it was a great, it was a good episode. I love the message, and
It was a good episode. The message that it conveyed was great, I
very,
thought.
very powerful, very powerful, and I think every once in a while it's good for you know fantasy and sci-fi entertainment to be a little bit more serious at times and deal with these issues. So good on them.
So we're gonna take a break, and after the break, we will be covering the news that has pretty much changed the total landscape of the DC comic film franchise. With that, we'll be taking a break, and when we come back, we'll be covering the news that has swept the internet. Well, we're back on the Schuster Herald with the news that has swept the internet over the last week about the new DC comic franchise finally coming together. Adam, do you want to take it over from here?
I,
Because you've been following the developments as this broke last Sunday night, I take it?
I will gladly take over at this point, Sam. Yeah, it was funny because I was recording the other podcast that I'm on, World's Best Podcast, shameless plug number 3 or 4 on the show that I've done. That's all right. We had recorded another episode that was totally unrelated to anything that we're discussing here. And then I went on and I usually check, various sites for superhero movie news and whatnot, geek news basically. And I come across a report from Latino Review, one of their main scoopers, El Mayimbe, broke the news that there's big changes happening over at Warner Brothers, specifically with their DC franchises. The news is that Warner Brothers is in negotiations with Christopher Nolan to produce, or the term they use is Godfather, which means produce. He's not going to kill anybody, I hope. Um, unless it's John Peters, I could be down with that. But no, I'm kidding. Um, he's going to Godfather the entire DC universe slate of films, and much like he did with the upcoming Man of Steel. The interesting news is that aside from that, that every DC universe film in the future has to go through. Apparently, if all this is true, every DC universe film will have to go through the hands of Christopher Nolan. So he has to approve, and he's basically going to set it on a course and set up a director. And once that's done, then the director will take over and do his thing. What I'm interested in here is that where it pertains to a potential Justice League film, Warner Brothers has been trying since 2007 to get a Justice League film off the ground. The 2007 one didn't work, thank God, because honestly, it sounded like crap.
And that was the one with George Miller and them casting a whole bunch of young people in the
Yeah,
roles, right?
yeah, and it fell apart mainly due to the writer strike and budgetary reasons. Um, since then, obviously, Avengers came out and did mega bucks, and so Warner Brothers is really keen on we got to do a Justice League. So Christopher Nolan apparently is going to produce amazing thing, which I never thought I'd see again, is that Warner Brothers is trying to negotiate to get Christian Bale back as Batman. That is an astounding possibility because as we've been told all the way up to the release of Dark Knight Rises, was that this was the end of Chris Nolan and Christian Bale's time on Batman. But having said that, Christian Bale did, according to as El Mayimbe in his report pointed out, Christian Bale told Empire leading up to the film, The Dark Knight Rises, that if Chris Nolan came to him with a story, he would be interested in making a fourth appearance work.
Which is very exciting. I mean, this is the Batman of our generation, so to speak. And now that with Superman, what they're doing with Superman, Henry Cavill, by all standards, hopefully, if this movie does what it does, will be this generation Superman. So for the two of them to be on screen together, that's just crazy. It's gonna be so insane.
I think what's important to point out here is that this makes a lot of sense in my because a lot of people will look at that possibility and say, "Well, it's just a knee-jerk reaction." I don't think it is. I think this is the route they should have gone all along. I mean, to me, the knee-jerk reaction is what they were doing up until now, which was, well, let's have a Justice League franchise that is totally separate to the solo films. That makes no sense to me because you have, for instance, if you have, let's say, Henry Cavill playing Superman, and then you cast some other guy to play Superman in Justice League, that will confuse general audiences. They're going to be like, well, what the hell? One movie, one guy, Superman, and then so it's just to me that's a knee-jerk reaction. This where you potentially have Christian Bale who anchored your biggest franchise to date. I mean the Dark Knight trilogy made probably over $2.5 billion at the box office. It makes a lot of sense to bring the guy most recognizable as Batman back into the fold to sort of lead your to be the sort of face in terms of the public audience of your Justice League franchise. And the thing that I think needs to be pointed out is that a couple things. First of all, it wasn't. It's we're not sure yet. First of all, if El Mayimbe and has said that there's a chance that this could be not a Justice League film at first, but rather a world's finest film, which would pit Batman and Superman in one film together. So that I think is an interesting way to go as well if they choose to go that way. Also, he suggests that there's a good chance that Goyer would be brought on to write the script. Now, before we go any further with any news, I think it's important to point out that a lot of people, of course, right now this is none of this is confirmed because, as El Mayimbe pointed out, deals have to be put in place and there's got to be script approval and all that stuff. So, could this fall apart? Sure, but I trust that El Mayimbe knows what he's talking about because at least, especially not at least, but especially when it comes to scoops regarding the DC film franchises, because he was the first one to report that Heath Ledger was cast as the Joker. He was the first one to report that
Brandon Routh was Superman.
exactly, and he was also the first one to report that Christopher Nolan would produce Man of Steel. Not only that, but his claims have been backed up by two other reliable sources that I consider reliable. Batman on Film, which has been covering obviously Batman on Film for 15 years. That guy has connections of some sort, I'm not sure, to Christopher Nolan. So
And he said in one of his tweets most recently that he knew for 2 weeks prior to El Mayimbe, from Latino Review, running with the story.
but he didn't say anything out of respect for obviously El Mayimbe and also obviously for Christopher Nolan and everybody else involved. That's another point. Before I get to that, the other place that reported it, which leads me to believe there's more credence than just your average rumor, is the fact that it was covered on Forbes.com.
And
Now, I
mhm.
don't think Forbes is in the habit of reporting just some BS rumor. There have been, I will say this for fairness, um, there have been two sites that claimed, one site claims that Christopher Nolan will be back, but not Christian Bale. Another site claims that neither Nolan nor Bale will come back, and that only Henry Cavill is signed up to star. I will just give you my personal opinion. The two sites that reported both those conflicting bits, in my opinion, are both bullshit, and I'll tell you why. They are run by what I like to call, and Sam's heard this term before. They are run by what I like to term as basement dwellers. I don't believe they have any real sources. I believe their source might be their mother that is bringing them milk and cookies.
They're more like a tabloid version
Yeah,
of the more credible
that's
websites like Latino Review,
what they.
Variety, Forbes. So I mean, like you said, Adam, I don't put any stock unless it's coming from like El Maimble or Jet from Batman on Film, because I mean these guys are in the know. These guys are connected to the people in Hollywood that are making the decisions and that are a part of each of these productions. So
So
I'm
there's other sites that in my from I guess don't get me wrong, I check them out not for any factual news, just for most of the time for a laugh. But they've never broken a significant piece of news. They've never had a legitimate scoop. So why am I going to believe you when Batman on Film, El Mayimbe, and Forbes are saying Christopher Nolan and Christian Bale are in negotiations with Warner Brothers? I think I'm going to hedge my bet with the guys with the proven track record. Again, could the negotiations potentially fall apart? Sure, it's Hollywood. Anything can happen. Do I think there's a good chance of this happening? Damn well bet I do. And I'm excited by it. And the other piece of news is that Zack Snyder will also, according to El Mayimbe, be a producer and he may also direct. That's unclear yet.
Yeah, I really hope that this really comes to fruition and we get to see Christian Bale and Henry Cavill's in Justice League, because it would just be the perfect defense to the Avengers in 2015. And I mean, to get butts into the seats, you're not going to want an Army Hammer Batman who you have nothing invested in emotionally from. in a role that has become synonymous with Christian Bale and Batman.
Let me say this, a couple of things. I've got nothing against Army Hammer. Actually, I think out of all those cast in the 2007 version of Justice League, he might have been the only one who did a good job as Batman. However, I kind of like the idea that in a Justice League, Batman is more of a veteran. He's more of a wiser, older Batman. And Christian Bale, not to say he's an old man, but he would be like Sam was saying, we've invested 8 years in Bale's Batman. He's been through the ringer in his trilogy, and I think it would be appropriate to have a Batman who is wiser than some of the other heroes and more skilled at the business of being a superhero, even though he has no powers. But what I think is going to be interesting now. This is where it gets kind of iffy, and there's two schools of thought might be happening here. What I'm curious about is how do you get the Bale's Batman, who had basically, in an off manner way, not specifically, but basically said, when him giving John Blake, aka Robin, the directions to the Batcave, and then you see him go there and you see the platform rise up. The illusion is that John Blake is now going to take over the mantle of Batman because Bruce Wayne is retired. He's in Italy. Everybody else thinks he's dead, and he's having a good old time with Anne Hathaway's Catwoman. Rightfully so. I would be too. Uh, the interesting thing is, how do you get him from retirement? How do you get him back in the game? That's going to be the reason I'm bringing this up is I would almost prefer that it is continued off the events of the trilogy. Now I know some fans of the trilogy, and I'm a huge fan of Nolan's trilogy, are of the belief leave it alone. You don't want to muck it up. You don't want to touch a near perfect superhero trilogy. I understand where they're coming from, but what I'm saying is, if anybody can find a way to reopen and continue that trilogy, don't you think it's the guy who started it, the two guys who were principals in the trilogy, Christian Bale and Christopher Nolan? If anybody's going to touch it, it'll be them two.
Yeah, I agree. I think they're gonna do something more like the Dark Knight Returns storyline, where something major happens that gets Bruce back in the game, or even like what Maimble said, maybe Superman encounters a dark side or encounters a Brainiac and needs backup, so he enlists the whole group of superheroes like the Flash, Wonder Woman, and he goes to Bruce and says, "I need your help." That'd be awesome. Just to see that shot in a trailer would be so cool.
I had some theories on this. To get Batman out of retirement, well, two things. I mean, who's to say at some point at the end, from the end of The Dark Knight Rises through the events of Man of Steel, I'm sure Bruce Wayne would see Zod and the Kryptonian invasion or whatever ends up happening in Man of Steel. I think it'll be that on the news. I mean, it's not just going to go on. We live in an age where, hey, if something like that were to happen, you're going to know about it right away. Bruce Wayne, even though he's sequestered in Italy or wherever the heck him and Catwoman are now, he'll know about it. And knowing that Bruce Wayne, the way we've come to know him through three films, I don't think he's going to say, well, yeah, Blake is back there in Gotham. He can handle it. I get the sense that as much as he protested in Dark Knight Rises that, or in The Dark Knight rather, that his time as Batman would come to an end, I think deep down inside, that he needs Batman as much as Gotham needs him. So I don't think it's going to be that easy for him just to see that he just sit there and leave it up to Blake. The other thing that could happen is maybe someone close to Batman dies, which drives Batman or Bruce Wayne back to the cowl to exact vengeance. And who am I thinking? Well, it could be two things. Maybe Selena Kyle meets her end. I hope not, because that would be a terrible waste of Anne Hathaway, even though chances are she wouldn't appear in the world's finest or Justice League movie. But maybe, Sam, and you probably know, you'd probably be able to guess this, maybe not, but in the comics, what has always driven Batman to a state where he goes nuts and is in vengeance mode?
Well, it's always been like a death of a family member, like Robin, or when Batgirl got paralyzed by the Joker in The Killing Joke. It's always been something like that that's driven Batman.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Sam, because what do we have? Well, we don't have a Robin per se, but John Blake, first of all, his first name is Robin. Second of all, he is an amalgamation of all three Robins. So who's to say at some point, or whether it's mentioned or shown, that during his time filling in for Bruce, John Blake meets an untimely end. Cue Batman's Bruce Wayne's, call to arms, and you
And
know,
he's back in the fold just like that. So I
and
mean, there's a number of different ways they could go with
yeah,
Bruce's storyline moving forward with Nolan and Christian Bale, which we all hope happens. It's going to be interesting to see what happens this summer and how Man of Steel is perceived by the general audience. Um, it's such an exciting time right now to be a DC comic fan because Warner Brothers has all their ducks in a row, so to speak. Now it's going to be interesting to see what a Nolanized version of the Flash is going to look like, what Wonder Woman's going to look like, what they're going to do with Green Lantern. Are they going to bring Ryan Reynolds back or not? Which I, I have no opinion. I liked Green Lantern for what it was. There were things in that movie that I thought needed to be done right that they did totally wrong, but it for what it was, it got people interested in the character.
don't get me wrong. There are a lot of questions that need to be answered. If all the deals are worked out, and if Man of Steel is a success, now let's preface this by saying I think anything that happens going forward is predicated on Man of Steel being a success. So we all had ample reason to watch it before because it looks amazing. But if you need another reason to watch Man of Steel, this is it. The fact that watch it, because if you watch it and it's successful, we get Christopher Nolan godfathering the entire DCU, and we get Christian Bale back in either a world's finest or Justice League movie. So watch Man of Steel. For the love of God, please watch it.
So everything is predicated now as Man of Steel being the linchpin for Justice League and for World's Finest and whatever they plan to do moving forward. So with that, we're gonna wrap up the show for this week. I'm your host Sam Rizzo,
And I'm your co-host, Adam Basciano.
and you've been listening to the Shuster Herald Podcast.